Hello and welcome to Storytime with Chocolate Button. It's lovely to see you all here. I'm very excited that you are going to listen to my story today. And my story today is Peter Pan by Sir J.M. Barrie. And which means it's written by a knight, which is very cool. But also it was written a long time ago, so I'm actually going to read a version of the story. There are lots and lots of different versions, but I'm going to read a version of the story by a lady called Joan Collins and illustrated by someone called, Annie Wilkinson. So we'll see the pictures by Annie Wilkinson and the words by Joan Collins, but the original story is by Sir J.M. Barrie. So I'll show you the pictures as I read, but I will also show you some pictures by a lady called Sarah Warburton from a different book. So you can kind of see a range of different pictures. Anyway, I'm very excited, so let's get started. Chapter 1. The Boy Who Never Grew Up. This is the story of Peter Pan, a boy who never grew up, but ran away to live in the Neverland when he was small. The Neverland is an island that children visit in their dreams and where anything can happen. To reach it, you have to be able to fly. Peter could fly. Sometimes when he felt lonely, he went back to the human world and listened at nursery windows to the bedtime stories mothers told their children. 3 children called Wendy, Michael and John Darling lived with their parents near Kensington Gardens. This was one of Peter's favourite places, and you can see a statue of him there. The children had an unusual nurse called Nana. She was a big Newfoundland dog who slept in a kennel in the nursery. If she had been on guard the night Peter came, this story would never have happened. Mrs. Darling was a happy woman who hugged and kissed her children often. Mr. Darling was more serious. He worried a lot and did not think it was a good idea to have a dog for a nursemaid. Mrs. Darling used to tell the children bedtime stories every night, and then she tucked them in and lit their night lights. As she tidied up the nursery, she would wonder what they were dreaming about. If Mrs. Darling could have seen into their minds, she would have seen a picture map of the island of Neverland. It had a lagoon, a pirate ship, flamingos, and a coral reef. There was a forest with wild beasts and fairies. Mrs. Darling was puzzled because the children talked so much about a boy called Peter Pan. They said he lived with the fairies. Mr. Darling thought it must be some silly tale Nana had told them. "It all comes from having a dog as a nurse," he grumbled. One day Mrs. Darling found some leaves just under the nursery window. "Oh, Peter must have dropped them," said Wendy. "He's so untidy." "But it's 3 floors up. How could he get here?" said Mrs. Darling. "You must have been dreaming." But Wendy had not been dreaming. The very next night Mrs. Darling was sewing by the nursery fire and had almost fallen asleep. The window blew open and a boy dropped in on the floor. He was dressed all in leaves. A strange little light followed him, darting round the room like a living thing. It woke Mrs. Darling, who knew at once that the boy was Peter Pan. She cried out in alarm, and Nana sprang at the boy, who leapt back through the window. Nana closed it, just catching his shadow by the feet. Nana picked up the shadow and took it to her mistress, who rolled it up and put it in a drawer. The following Friday, Mr. and Mrs. Darling were invited to a party at a house a few doors away. Mrs. Darling was very cross with Nana and decided she had to be chained up in the yard. Mrs. Darling was worried because Nana kept barking. "That's not her usual bark," she said. "She only barks like that when there's danger." "Nonsense," said Mr. Darling. "Hurry up, or we'll be late for the party." As the front door closed, a bright light appeared in the nursery, darting into the drawers and cupboards. When the light stayed still for a moment, you could see it was not a light at all, but a fairy called Tinker Bell. The next moment, Peter himself came through the window. "Come on, Tink, wherever you are," he said, "and show me where my shadow is." Tinker Bell told him it was in a drawer. She spoke in a golden twinkle like a chime of tiny bells. Peter pulled out his shadow and shut the drawer, forgetting that Tinker Bell was still inside. He tried to stick his shadow back on with water and then with soap. Nothing worked. He was in despair when Wendy woke up. "What's the matter?" she asked. "My shadow won't stick on," Peter complained. "Give it to me," said Wendy. "I'll sew it on." Peter was thrilled to have his shadow back, and Wendy was so pleased that she offered him a kiss. Peter had never heard of a kiss, but he thought it must be a present, so he held out his hand. Wendy gave him her thimble instead, and forever after that he called a kiss a thimble. In return for the thimble, Peter gave Wendy an acorn button from his coat. She put it on a chain around her neck. Later on, it would save her life. Peter told Wendy all about how he had run away to live with the fairies in Kensington Gardens. Now he lived in Neverland with the Lost Boys. The Lost Boys were children who had fallen out of their prams when their nurses were not looking. Nobody claimed them, so they were sent to Neverland. Wendy asked about the fairies. "Once a baby's laugh broke into 1,000 pieces," exclaimed Peter. "Each piece became a fairy. But now children don't believe in fairies so much. Every time a child says, 'I don't believe in fairies,' a fairy somewhere drops down dead." That reminded Peter of Tinker Bell, who was still shut up in the drawer. She zoomed out in a fury and buzzed round the room. Wendy thought Tink was lovely, but Tinker Bell hated Wendy and was jealous of her. When Peter gave Wendy a thimble, Tinker Bell gave her hair a spiteful tug. Chapter 2. Follow Me. By now, Michael and John were awake. Peter told them all about the gang of lost boys, of which he was the captain, and their fights with the pirates. "Aren't there any lost girls?" asked Wendy. "No," said Peter. "We haven't got any sisters or mothers to tell us stories." "You poor boy," exclaimed Wendy. "I know lots of stories." That was just what Peter wanted, to take Wendy and her brothers back to the Neverland with him. He promised to teach them how to fly. In the yard, Nana was barking like mad. She knew something was wrong. At last she broke her chain and galloped up to the house where the party was. She got Mr. and Mrs. Darling, and they all ran down the street as fast as they could. By now Peter had blown magic dust all over the children and was showing them how to fly. "Just wriggle your shoulders and let go," he cried, swooping round the room. One by one they took off from their beds and followed him. "I flewed! I flewed!" shouted Michael. "Look at me!" called John, bumping against the ceiling. He was wearing his Sunday top hat and looked very funny. "Oh, lovely!" cried Wendy in mid-air. Mr. and Mrs. Darling and Nana could see the nursery window lit up against the curtains. They saw the shadows of 3 little figures circling round and round in the air. No, not 3, 4. They rushed upstairs and burst into the room, but they were too late. Peter had said, "Follow me," and soared out into the night with John, Michael and Wendy right behind him. Chapter 3. The Flight. Peter said that the way to Neverland was easy. Second start at the right and straight on till morning. But it seemed to take a very long time. At first it was fun. The children circled round church spires and raced each other among the clouds. But as they went on, they grew tired and hungry. Peter stole food from them from the beaks of passing birds, but it was not like a proper meal. At last they saw the Neverland below. It was just as they had imagined. They saw the mermaids' lagoon, the redskins' wigwams, and the wild beasts. As they flew down through the treetops, Peter told the children about the pirates and their dreaded leader, Captain Hook. The children had all heard of him. He was the most bloodthirsty buccaneer who had ever sailed the Spanish Main. "I cut off his right hand," said Peter proudly. "Now he has an iron hook instead, and he uses it like a claw." The children shivered. "One thing you must promise," Peter went on. "If we meet Captain Hook in open fight, leave me to deal with him." The children promised. Just then Tinker Bell flew up to warn them that the pirates had loaded their big gun, Big Tom. They could tell where Peter and his friends were by Tink's light, so the children hid her in John's top hat, which Wendy carried. Suddenly there was an enormous bang. The gun had been fired. The blast blew them onto their backs and scattered them. and Tinker Bell and Wendy were separated from the rest. This was Tink's great chance. She was still jealous of Wendy and wanted to get rid of her. So with her golden tinkle, she led Wendy away in quite the wrong direction. Chapter 4. The Island Comes True. Now that Peter was coming back, the Neverland came to life. The Lost Boys set out to look for their captain, and the pirates were looking for the Lost Boys. The Redskins were stalking the pirates, and the wild beasts were tracking the Redskins. There were 6 Lost Boys: Tootles, the unlucky one; Nibs, the cheerful one; Slightly, the conceited one; Curly was always in trouble; and the twins. They crept along behind the bushes in single file, clutching their daggers. Then came the pirates, with their evil looks, some wearing gold earrings, others tattooed all over. They had names like Checo, Bill Jukes, and Gentleman Starkey. The worst one, because he looked so meek and mild, was Smee the boatswain. He had a cutlass named Jimmy Corkscrew, which he wriggled into victims' wounds. Their leader, Captain Jas, short for James, Hook, was the most evil rogue of all. He feared nothing except the sight of his own blood, which was an ugly colour. He treated his men like dogs and smoked 2 cigars at once in a special holder. Hook had a lean, scowling face and long black ringlets. He thought he looked like Charles II and dressed like him. If any of his crew annoyed him, out shot his hook. There would be a tearing sound, a scream, and then the body would be tossed aside. Hook was Peter Pan's greatest enemy. On the trail of the pirates stole the Redskins. Great Big Little Panther was their chief, and Tiger Lily their princess. She was a beautiful, proud maiden, as brave as any warrior. Next came a procession of wild beasts, man-eating lions, tigers, and the like, all with their tongues hanging out for food. Last of all, there came an enormous crocodile. The Lost Boys reached their underground home, a cave hollowed out under the roots of 7 tall trees. Each trunk had a door, a hole just big enough for a boy to wriggle into. There was 1 door for each boy, and 1 for Peter Pan. So far, the pirates had not discovered them. Although the pirates tried to catch Nibs as he ran away, Hook held them back. "1 is no good," he said. "I want all of them." And he sat down to wait while the pirates searched the wood. As he sat, Hook told Smee about how Peter Pan had cut off his hand. "He threw it to a passing crocodile," Hook snarled. "It liked the taste so much that it has followed me ever since, licking its lips for the rest of me. Luckily, it also swallowed a clock. It goes tick, 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 so I can hear it coming and escape." "One day," said Smee, "the clock will run down." "That's what I'm afraid of," said Hook. Just then a familiar sound reached Hook's ears. Tick, 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 tick. It was the crocodile. Hook and Smee dashed away, and the boys came out of hiding. Nibs rushed back, pointing up at the sky. Something like a great white bird was floating their way. They didn't know that it was actually Wendy in her nightie. Tinker Bell was flying all around her, pinching her. Wendy was moaning, "Poor Wendy," to herself. "Peter wants you to shoot the Wendy bird," Tink called to the boys. The boys always did what Peter wanted, so they hurried away for their bows and arrows. Tootles was first back. "Quick, Tootles, quick!" Tink screamed. "Peter will be so pleased." Tootles fitted an arrow to his bow and fired. Wendy fluttered to the ground, the arrow in her heart. Chapter 5. The Little House and the Home Underground. When the boys crowded round to see the Wendy bird, they discovered to their horror that it was a lady. "A mother to take care of us," said the twins, "and Tootles has shot her." It was all part of Tootles' bad luck. He would have run away if Peter hadn't arrived. "I've brought you all a mother," he said joyfully. "Haven't you seen her? She flew this way." The Lost Boys stood aside and showed him Wendy. "She is dead," said Peter. "Who shot her?" "I did," Tootles confessed. "Now kill me." Peter was raising the arrow to strike when Nibs shouted, "The Wendy lady moved her arm." Poor Toodles, Wendy moaned. She's alive, Peter cried. He knelt down and saw that the acorn button he had given her had stopped the arrow and saved her life. Listen to Tink, said Curly. She's crying because Wendy's not dead. When the boys told Peter what Tinker Bell had done, Peter was furious. I am no longer your friend, Tinker Bell, he said. Go away forever. Wendy moved her arm again. Well, said Peter, go away for a week then. Tinker Bell wasn't the least bit grateful to Wendy. She just flew away as cross as two sticks. The lost boys didn't know what they should do for Wendy. They couldn't carry her down into the cave. I know, said Peter. We'll build a little house all round her. The boys rushed off to fetch branches, bedding and firewood, and Michael and John helped. Bit by bit, the house was built with a green moss carpet, red walls, and a door and windows. At last, all it needed was a chimney. Peter knocked the top of John's Sunday hat and fitted it on the roof. It began to smoke at once. This is your own little house, said Peter, and we are your children, said the lost boys. The cave where Peter and the boys lived was one enormous room. There was a huge bed slung against the wall, which was let down at night. The lost boys slept in it like sardines in a tin. Tinker Bell had her own very tiny room, elegantly furnished with a couch, a dressing table, and a mirror. There was even a crystal chandelier. Wendy did all of the cooking for the boys. They ate island food, roast pig, breadfruit, and bananas. Wendy liked to sit by the fire at night, when the boys were asleep darning their socks.